I'd like to welcome our second panel, Chairman Jason Smith and Representative Danny Davis from the Ways and Means Committee. Chairman Smith, it's always good to see you here. I welcome your testimony whenever you're prepared to begin.
Thank you, Chairman Cole, Ranking Member McGovern. It's always a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this crucial legislation that will protect taxpayers and victims of fraud against the largest theft of tax dollars in American history. Americans had their identities and benefit payments stolen from them as criminal organizations and foreign fraudsters exploited the pandemic to steal hundreds of billions of dollars intended to keep workers afloat during an economic crisis. Appearing before the Ways and Means Committee, the Department of Labor Inspector General warned that taxpayers may be on the hook for at least $191 billion in improper payments. Outside experts estimate a much larger number, up to $400 billion. Either amount is completely unacceptable, with hundreds of billions of dollars in unemployment benefits potentially misspent or stolen. Individuals in need were left to fend for themselves while working Americans were trying to piece their lives back together. Congress, under Democrat rule, did nothing to fight fraud as it was happening. When Democrats held the majority on Ways and Means, they ignored, they blocked, and they shot down common sense amendments and safeguards and refused to even hold hearings on this very issue. And for all of the Biden administration's talks, they have dropped the ball on going after fraudsters. During his first State of the Union, President Biden said, "The watchdogs are back." Since then, his chief pandemic prosecutor for COVID fraud has resigned, and the position is still sitting vacant. That's not accountability. We couldn't afford inaction for 2 years, and we can afford it even less today. The Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act takes much needed overdue action to recover fraudulently paid COVID benefits, prevent future fraud, and prosecute the criminals responsible. It allows states to retain 25% of fraudulent federal funds recovered that they can then use to improve UI program integrity and fraud prevention, providing a real incentive for states to pursue investigations and prosecutions. With these dollars, states can hire investigators to go after criminals to recover fraud payments, modernize identity and income verification systems, and deter, detect, and prevent improper payments. Included in these reforms are policies supported by the Department of Labor Inspector General, and in past budget requests from both President Trump and President Obama. We also stop UI payments to incarcerated and deceased individuals. Finally, we extend the statute of limitations for prosecuting fraud from 5 to 10 years as recommended by the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee in testimony provided to the Ways and Means Committee. The amendment offered alongside the underlining bill today adds an extra layer of protection for states. While this bill should result in an increase in the funds states have available to pay future UI claims as improper payments are reduced, the language is necessary to satisfy congressional scorekeepers' inability to estimate savings from enhanced program integrity measures. After years of pressure from Republicans, and even President Biden included several of the same fraud recovery and prevention measures contained in this bill in his fiscal year 24 budget request, I'm hopeful House Democrats will finally take a similar step to protect taxpayers and support H.R. 1163. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Representative Davis, good to have you here. You're recognized for your opening statement.
To fight fraud, every House Republican voted against those investments to prevent fraud and hold criminals accountable. H.R. 1163 does not fight fraud. Rather, it claws back $400 million that is already hard at work fighting fraud instead of punishing organized crime. This Republican bill punishes workers. Unconscionably, the GOP bill will send an estimated $91 million in surplus bills, surprise bills, to American workers who received accidental overpayments through no fault of their own. Further, this clause back benefits can occur up to 10 years after these unemployed workers spent the funds on basic necessities like shelter and food. Congress forgave over $755 billion in Paycheck Protection Program loans to businesses. But this Republican House seeks to exact $91 million in accidental overpayments from innocent unemployed workers. This rescission of funds is apparent on page 3, lines 24 to 25 of the bill, where it changes the recovery period from 3 to 10 years. When you redline this change to Section 2104F, 3 of the CARES Act, you clearly see that the bill encourages states to reclaim any overpayment. The CBO estimate of H.R. 1163 also makes clear that the increased collection period applies to all overpayments of those pandemic unemployment benefits to 10 years following the overpayment, not to just fraud. Contrary to the claims of my Republican colleagues, this bill does not limit the clawback of funds to fraud only when my GOP colleagues incorrectly assert that the bill limits collections to fraud. They are only referring to the very narrow limit on the ability of states to keep portions of the fraud payments. We bipartisanly enacted pandemic unemployment benefits that kept an estimated 5 million people a year from falling into poverty. This assistance meant revenue and customers for businesses and helped spur our economic recovery. Unfortunately, when disaster struck, state unemployment systems were not prepared. At the hands of Republican budget cuts, many states have decades-old technology and remain severely understaffed. Mistakes were made, and thousands of workers were overpaid. According to the Department of Labor's Inspector General, the primary causes of overpayments were insufficient staffing, antiquated IT systems, and unclear guidance from the Trump Department of Labor. Again, we worked bipartisanly to encourage states to waive overpayments to protect unemployed workers. Now Republicans want to take back these waived overpayments under the guise of combating fraud. Yet again, Republicans are putting the wealthy and well-connected before workers. Rather than protecting workers from the CBO estimated $91 million in surprise bills, and rather than protecting the remaining $400 million in ARPA funding that Democrats dedicated to prevent fraud and strengthen the state unemployment systems, the Republicans' manager's amendment only protects businesses from the tax increases that the bill itself would impose. My Democratic colleagues and I have offered many amendments to invest in anti-fraud efforts, protect workers, and strengthen state unemployment systems. Representative Higgins' amendment would reverse the Republican cut of funding to fight fraud. Representative Sanchez's amendment would prevent future fraud and strengthen state unemployment office by striking the anti-labor provisions. The bill's waiving of the merit staffing undermines the integrity of the unemployment insurance system that the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, SEIU, and the National Employment Law Project, as well as the Communication Workers of America, all oppose this bill. And I'm surprised that Representative Fitzpatrick voted against Representative Sanchez's amendment to strike Section 5 of the bill in committee, along with every Republican on the Ways and Means Committee, yet offered Representative Sanchez's amendment to the Rules Committee. Numerous Democrats offered amendments to protect vulnerable workers who would be harmed by H.R. 1163. Representative Larson and I have amendments to protect Social Security beneficiaries. Representative Panetta's amendment would protect farmers. Representative Sykes and Plaskett's amendments would protect rural residents. Representative Frost and Ocasio-Cortez's amendment protect workers who experience natural disasters. In 2020 and 2021, Oklahoma, Texas, Kentucky, South Carolina, Florida, and California experienced horrible tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, droughts, and wildfires. I would think that members of this committee would want to protect these disaster victims from having their overpayments clawed back. There are amendments to protect Medicaid recipients, small business owners and employees, child care workers, first responders, grocery workers, restaurant and food industry workers, low-income workers, school personnel, foster youth, homeless youth, hospitality and tourism workers, construction industry workers, workers experiencing housing insecurity, and parents of minor children. All of these workers were unemployed through no fault of their own. All of these workers received overpayments through no fault of their own. You know who they are. We know who they are because they called our offices by the thousands, begging for help during the pandemic. The CBO scores of these Democratic amendments makes it clear that they would protect innocent workers. These Democratic amendments only protect innocent workers from the clawback of overpayments. The fact that the CBO indicates that these amendments increase direct spending proves that the Republican bill will make these innocent workers repay overpayments. The Republican claim that only fraudsters will pay is correct. If the committee makes in order the manager's amendment that increases direct revenue to protect businesses from having to pay more in taxes, I hope the committee will make these Democratic amendments in order to protect innocent workers. Members of the Rules Committee have the ability to stop this harm to innocent unemployed workers who received accidental overpayments. You can protect them. According to the Department of Labor's Trust Fund Solvency Report, released in March 2023, only 16 states met the recommended solvency standard for unemployment systems. In order to address the fragility of the state unemployment system, the President's budget includes a 15% increase in funds to strengthen state unemployment system. In contrast, the Republican solution is to gut federal funding to fight fraud, to impose cruel surprise bills that harm innocent workers who were unemployed during the pandemic, and to weaken state unemployment systems. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill that punishes American families while stunting accountability for actual criminals. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you'll
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, the chair will forego questions. So, Dr. Burgess, you're recognized for questions.
Well, I want to thank both of our witnesses for being with us so late this evening. You've done such a great job with your presentations. I have no questions. I hope we pass an appropriate rule to allow your bill to come to the floor.
Thank you. I now recognize our distinguished ranking member for any questions he may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the statement of administration. The SAP says, and I quote, "The administration strongly opposes H.R. 1163. Contrary to its stated purpose, this bill would strip state unemployment insurance programs of essential resources to fight fraud, combat identity theft, and recover overpayments, and would set back the goals of strengthening the program integrity and combating systemic fraud," end quote. It further says, and I quote, "If the President were presented with H.R. 1163, he would veto it," end quote. Mr. Davis, the Ways and Means Committee,
Without objection.
thank you, the Ways and Means Committee recently held a hearing on UI fraud. Does this bill address the policy recommendations made by the witnesses?
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. The recent Ways and Means hearing featured only Republican-invited witnesses. The bill does not address the following Republican witness recommendations. They were to provide adequate and consistent funding for state staffing and technology, or restore cuts to the Biden budget forced by Republicans. GAO, DOL Inspector Generals, and the head of the Pandemic Unemployment Task Force fully fund investigations and prosecutions by the DOL Inspector General, clearly amend the criminal code to extend the statute of limitations for specific crimes during the pandemic to ensure that those who committed criminal fraud are brought to justice. These are from the DOL Inspector General. In fact, every expert we heard from at our full committee hearing said that the single most effective way to prevent future fraud would be to reliably, predictably, and adequately fund administration of the program so that states had functional technology and enough well-trained staff. This bill does not do that, and the Ways and Means Chair ruled that an amendment to address this recommendation as non-germane to the topic, showing a disdain for what is actually needed.
And let me ask you, what will the Department of Labor have to cut if the remaining $400 million in ARPA funding is rescinded?
Mr. McGovern, DOL is preparing to release about $200 million in state grants to fund best practices in fraud prevention, detection, and overpayment recovery, including ways to approach identity verification that balance the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that is NIST which is identity verification standards with equitable access to benefits. DOL is also prepared to make substantial investments in state technology upgrades and using the funding to provide ongoing support to the Tiger teams that advise states on system improvements. Further eliminating the ARPA dollars also would put the DOL Inspector General's fraud investigation at risk in the future because DOL is using conditions of funding on ARPA grants to ensure that the Inspector General has access to state data needed for fraud investigations. The loss of the ARPA funds would likely make DOL unable to extend the grants, which means the Inspector General might lose access. At the beginning of the pandemic, the Trump Department of Labor refused to help the Inspector General get data access, forcing them to subpoena all the states and delaying investigations by several months.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, maybe I missed this in the opening. What kind of rule did you request? Did you request open rule, modified closed rule, or closed rule? What did you have? I didn't hear.
I would assume since this is a revenue bill, this would be considered a closed rule.
Well, there's no magic rule that says because it's a revenue bill that
That's typically what the practice has
has to be
been.
the closed rule.
Can I chime in to
You
a
can say
statement
whatever you want to say.
that was made earlier? The witnesses that was at our hearing were all government witnesses. It was the GAO Comptroller General, it was the Department of Labor Inspector General, and it was the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. Those were the three witnesses. They were government witnesses.
Do you consult with the ranking member about these witnesses, or do you just do it on your own?
I consult with the ranking member on all kinds of things.
But I mean, on these
Hearing was-
witnesses, I don't know. They may have been perfectly fine witnesses. I don't know.
believe
But I guess
Biden,
the
Mr.
point he was
President,
making,
was your
the point
administration.
that he was making was that he did not, if I'm understanding Mr. Davis correctly, that the Democrats were not asked which witnesses that they would like to see.
And the money that's being pulled out is also unobligated COVID dollars, the $400 million. It has not been obligated by the Department of Labor. It's only unobligated funds.
Yeah, well, let me just make one final comment here. I mean, this has been a long day, and it's not over yet. It's going to continue to get longer. And we're dealing with two pieces of legislation that, if you're a betting person, aren't going to go anywhere because the president has veto threats against both of them. And it is a little bit frustrating to be dealing with both these bills right now when we do have a problem in this country. We heard a lot on the earlier panel about our security. Well, we have people dying of gun violence every day in this country. We have massacres happening every day in this country. We had a massacre that took place in Allen, Texas on Saturday, and not a word from anyone about that, and not a peep on what we're going to do about it. And we have this happen over and over and over again. And it's just, at some point, we have to focus in on the people's business and solving problems that, quite frankly, we're going to have to come together on and figure out a way to deal with it. And it's also worth noting that on this day, while we're doing all of this and ignoring the gun violence in this country, a jury found that Donald Trump, the Republican frontrunner, liable for sexual abuse and defamation. On this same day, we find out that your Republican colleague, George Santos, if that's his real name, has been criminally charged by the Department of Justice. And, I mean, I will tell you, objective observers watching what we are doing have to be scratching their head and saying, what the hell is wrong with this place? In any event, I have no further questions. I yield back my time.
Thank you. I think objective observers would also say, why aren't they doing anything at the border with drugs pouring across it? Skyrocketing illegal immigration as well.
Well, I think we had a pretty good debate about why we feel that what was proposed in the previous bill is a soundbite and not a real solution. But in any event, I thank the gentleman.
Fair enough. Real problem. Recognize the gentleman from South Carolina for any questions he may have.
Ms. Smith, this administration wants to spend hire 87,000 IRS agents. Was it specified, are they going after unemployment insurance fraud, or what's their main?
Yeah, the IRS agents would be going after the taxpayers' revenues. And clearly you could tell after the 1099K provisions of the American Rescue Plan that if anyone is spending more than $600 in PayPal or Venmo, I'm sure that that's what those IRS agents are going to be going after. They need to make sure that every penny in any American's couch cushions are accounted for. It's not to go after billionaires. It's clearly about working class families. In fact, CBO came out and said that this would affect a lot of individuals under $75,000 a year.
So really, they're not that concerned about the billions that are spent on, that are actual fraud that are being, taxpayers having to pay for.
Mr. Norman, I believe it's all about having more command and control over the lives and livelihoods of hardworking Americans.
The $5 billion, I think, is the number in here that's been recovered so far. Where is that money going?
Yeah, that would come back into the fund, but $5.5 billion has been recovered. But the Department of Labor has said that there's upward of $191 billion of fraud. And outside reports say that there's up to $400 billion of fraud. And think about this. The unemployment was just over $800 billion. And even the Department of Labor says there's $191 billion of fraud, but we've only recovered $5.5 billion. There's a big problem.
In other words, the squeeze, the juice would be worth the squeeze to recover just 5% more than has been recovered now.
It would be nice. It would be nice to get hard-earned taxpayer dollars in the right places. These are fraudsters. There were individuals that took unemployment out in more than 40 different states. They bought Lamborghinis. We're talking about people who committed fraud, not people who got overpayment. This language of this bill is very specific. On pages 4 and 5, it's only with people who have intent, and that's fraud, not people who were just an average American who got an overpayment.
So they just didn't make an innocent mistake. It was pretty intentional.
It has to be intentional according to the letter of this bill. It has to be by fraud. We are only going after people in fraud, and it's on pages 4 and 5, not people who just received overpayments that was not part of fraud.
Appreciate you putting this up. Thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for her questions.
Thank you. I thought we were talking about the Inflation Reduction Act there for a minute, because you started talking about the juice being worth the squeeze, trying to recover those taxpayer dollars that are owed by people with Lamborghinis, because that's what we're trying to do with the Inflation Reduction Act, is force wealthy corporations and billionaires to pay their fair share, because we know they don't right now. But instead, we're faced here today with a bill that goes after unemployment insurance, which kept many families afloat in my district and elsewhere. And yes, there was fraud, and absolutely we should claw back those dollars. Thank you, sorry. But this bill slashes a lot of the money that's supposed to be used to recover those dollars. It also cuts off programs that are already being rolled out to prevent against the kind of fraud that we saw with identity theft and that kind of thing. So I don't think it's a well-tailored objective here. Ranking Member Davis, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I would certainly agree with the comment that you've made and the comments that you've made. And contrary to the claims of my Republican colleagues, this bill does not limit the clawback of funds to fraud only. When my GOP colleagues incorrectly assert that the bill limits collections to fraud, they're only referring to the very narrow limit on the ability of states to keep portions of the fraud payments. The CBO estimate of H.R. 1163 also makes clear that the increased collection period applies to all overpayments of those pandemic unemployment benefits to 10 years following the overpayment, not just a fraud. And further, the CBO scores of the Democratic amendments that would only protect innocent workers makes clear that H.R. 1163 actually claws back overpayments from workers without fraud. The fact that the CBO indicates that these amendments increase direct spending proves that the Republicans' bill will make these innocent workers repay overpayment. We note that millions of dollars have been given or released from payment of businesses. We also want to make sure that the average worker, these individuals who through no fault of their own found themselves unemployed, and the money has been spent, it's gone, and there's no way that they're going to be able to recover and get it back.
By definition, we're talking about people who were out of work for a period of time and needed these benefits to get by. Certainly represented folks over time who've had overpayments through no fault of their own, through Social Security or otherwise, and it's a real burden on their families when they're put in a position where the government's trying to claw something back that they didn't knowingly take when they shouldn't have. I think that's fine. Thank you. Appreciate your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for testifying today. I appreciate your time. I'm just going to jump right in. Chairman Smith, Democrats keep talking about the $2 billion they provided to the Department of Labor as part of their bloated American Rescue Plan Act. It's interesting to me because, as you said, despite repeated calls for oversight hearings, congressional Democrats failed to hold a single hearing during the 2 years this was happening, despite multiple alerts and red flags from law enforcement agencies. I'd like to know how Democrats could possibly have known what to do with $2 billion for fraud when they abdicated their oversight responsibilities and failed to spend any time asking questions as to what needed to be done. Chairman Smith, what did the Department of Labor do with this money? How much of the $191 to $400 billion in stolen funds has been recovered by the Biden administration?
Thank you, Representative. Only $5.5 billion has been recovered from the Biden administration, even though the Department of Labor has projected there's more than $191 billion at minimum, upwards to $400 billion. And I would like to point out, based on some of the prior statements, the bill is very, very clear. Even if you're not a lawyer, you can understand the language of this bill on pages 4 and 5. And on pages 4 and 5, section 2A2 and section 2A3, it says that the state agency may retain 25% of any amount recovered from overpayments of pandemic emergency unemployment compensation that were determined to be made due to fraud. So no innocent person will have overpayments taken unless they fraudulently did it. It's in the clear language. There's no other aspect. You can say any argument you want, but they just simply don't want to go after fraud that are criminals, not innocent people, because innocent people are protected by the language of the law.
Thank you. President Biden released a statement of administration policy opposing this bill and championing their efforts to safeguard UI programs and recover fraud. Has the Biden administration proposed any efforts to go after fraud or offered any other solutions to the problem?
You know, they've offered a couple, and in fact, several of them are in this bill that they're now opposing. They also said that they were going to go after fraud and have a pandemic fraud prosecutor. Apparently, that's been vacant since December, so it's not a desire of theirs to truly go after the hundreds of billions of fraud that's being stolen from Americans.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thanks for your time. I appreciate your leadership on this issue. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for her questions.
Thank you very much. You know, I think it's quite incredible that the manner in which the United States recovered from a worldwide pandemic that devastated economies across this planet. And the United States, through the American Rescue Plan, really focused for the first time on making sure that we help the working people, the people who lost their jobs through no fault of their own because we were facing a pandemic. And unemployment insurance was the means of helping regular working people. And I think that that's something that we need to celebrate. It's unfortunate that Republicans do not like to recognize how successful that was. We should be proud of what America was able to accomplish in terms of making sure that we have job growth, that we now have the lowest unemployment rate in decades. I think it's back to the 60s now. And it was partially by making sure that people did not lose faith and that we kept businesses alive. Through the PPP, through the revitalization program, all of those were essential. Now, what we still want to do is there's still more work because that was a pandemic. We had to react to what was there. And we found out that many of the states' unemployment systems were antiquated. They just could not deal with the pandemic that we were facing. It strikes me that it makes a lot of sense to keep in place funding that will assist our own Office of Inspector General in our own efforts to go after any fraud that was there. And this bill does not do this. This bill would strip us of that authority. And for those reasons, I associate my comments with our ranking member as well as the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Gentleman from New York is recognized for his questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Smith, for bringing this legislation forward. I'd like to take a moment as a member from New York, one of the states with the worst unemployment fraud numbers, to say thank you for the work that went into this legislation. This seems like a ridiculous anecdote, but I personally, as the state Republican Party chairman of New York, which was my previous job before taking office this year, was a victim of unemployment fraud. So while I was serving as the state Republican Party chairman during the pandemic, a fraudster from an address 3 addresses ago applied for insurance in my name. Also, my home county of Erie County's district attorney was a victim of unemployment fraud. These fraudsters knew no bounds, and there were no guardrails in place by a very failed unemployment insurance system in our state to guard against this. And I won't take too much more of everyone's time here, but I'd like to quote some more New York-specific numbers of the moment. According to an audit by the New York State Department of Labor, New York State lost an estimated $11 billion during the pandemic due to unemployment fraud. In the period of 20 to 21, at the height of the pandemic, the improper payment rate increased from a high rate to 28.89%. But the thing is, this was a long time coming. My state, as many other blue states they've seen, had been seen as well, had warnings as far back as 2010 about the desire and the state of its unemployment insurance system and an urgent need for reforms against fraud. But did we act on it? Of course we didn't. Even though my state last week enacted a $229 billion budget, we, a few years ago allowed billions of dollars in fraud to be committed during the pandemic and years before as a result of intransigence and refusal to be good stewards of tax dollars. So, Chairman Smith, you may be interested to know that New York State actually completed a proposal in 2017 to begin the modernization process on its unemployment insurance to the tune of $57 million. Now, H.R. 1163 expands funding available to states to address waste, fraud, and abuse in the unemployment insurance plan. Is that correct? That's correct. Okay, thank you. So it's reasonable to say that this bill, with its provisions that allow states to retain 25% of the amounts recovered in order to protect the integrity of the program, could have gone a long way towards the proposed modernization process that New York was planning to take on and didn't. And that's the purpose of the program, correct? That they allow to retain those funds.
That's absolutely correct, to help program integrity.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. And I think it's clear evidence that this legislation is a common sense approach to fix a broken system in the states. Every dollar that fell through the cracks here in the form of fraud was a dollar that couldn't go to saving a business or, helping a family who genuinely needed it. And now taxpayers in my state and around the country, they're on the hook for billions in fraud, frankly, money that we borrowed and we're paying interest on because we permitted this fraud to continue. Democrats have had plenty of ample opportunity, as they have in my own state of New York, after more than a decade of alerts to this problem, to ensure sufficient protections for unemployment insurance were in place. But the choice that the Democrats in Albany and Washington and elsewhere made was simple: sit on your hands and do nothing. So as a New Yorker, thank you, Chairman Smith, for your leadership in bringing this here today, as well as for helping to illustrate how reasonable and responsible that this legislation truly is. Let's cut through the hysteria here and remember that programs like these are meant for those who actually need them in their moment of need. Those who vote against this legislation are voting against the hardworking American who loses their job and depends on it as a safety net to be there for them. I appreciate everyone's work on this important legislation, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Are there any additional questions for this panel? Mr. Neguse? Okay, with that, thank you both for appearing this evening, and we appreciate it, and the witnesses are excused. Okay, we now have, no, I'm going to invite you up. Mr. Griffin, you're actually the first name on the list. You've been here so often. So I would, we'll now move to the amendment panel. And I would ask Mr. Griffin from Virginia, Ms. Moore from Wisconsin, Ms. Jackson Lee, Texas, Mr. Rouser from North Carolina, I saw him. Mr. Correa, I'm sorry, thank you very much. And Mr. Grossman. Well, obviously some aren't here, but we'll begin with these. The others arrive, we'll add them to a second panel. Oh, Ms. Moore, if you'd come to the panel.
Thank you.
You bet.
My good friend from Wisconsin. Back together again.
All right, if we could, we'll begin, and Mr. Griffin, we'll start with you to present whatever information you care to about your amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. This is a pretty simple amendment. It ought not be bipartisan. Let me apologize first to Dr. Burgess for going on this rant. He's heard it many times before. Most people don't realize that a small part of what we've been talking about in regard to the border falls under the jurisdiction of Energy and Commerce. And I have been passionate about the way that the Office of Refugee Resettlement has dealt with children at the border. We can have a partisan fight. We can disagree about whether or not children should be coming to the border in the first place. I don't think they should be, but that's not the issue. The issue is once they get here, we have a responsibility and a duty to make sure that these children are taken care of. And we're not doing the job. Now, many of you all don't know me, but I, at one time in my career, practiced law in domestic relations. My wife currently sits on the Virginia Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court. Folks, we got it all wrong at ORR. Now, this bill has some of the things that are needed. There's no question about that. It has some of that. But one of the things that I found appalling when I visited, and Dr. Burgess, I think, was on that trip when we went to Fort Bliss. I know you've been several times. was I started asking questions about, because they said they did a background check. Well, what kind of background check do you do? Well, we go on the internet and we look to see if the person who's a sponsor for an unaccompanied minor has a criminal record or something that's disturbing on the internet. Well, I said, well, are you doing a FBI background check? You going through VSIN, which would be the Virginia criminal, or any of the criminal? Oh, no. We just go to one of these things, and they basically describe people finders or Spokio. That's what they're doing. Then we read the New York Times article, which was previously submitted as evidence, and I know there are people who dispute how many kids are lost, but there are lost kids. They interviewed kids who are not going to school. And so we held a hearing in Energy and Commerce in the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, which I chair, trying to find answers about this. And one of the things that was appalling was they couldn't answer that day whether or not they did at least notify local officials when a child is placed into a particular jurisdiction. So if they placed a child in Floyd County, Virginia, they didn't know. But since then, and I don't know who I hand this to, I've received an email. I'll just read it to you, and then I'll hand it for y'all to look at. I received an email. It was a response to the oversight staff, and it's from Katie Spivey, Deputy Director, Congressional Affairs, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I wanted to follow up on one of the questions Chair Griffith asked during the IG's April 18 hearing. Our response is below. Let me know if you have any questions. Chairman Griffith, when a child is placed with a sponsor, does ORR notify any local department or social services office? Answer. Prepared response. It is OIG's understanding that ORR is not required to notify any local department or social service office when an unaccompanied child is placed with a sponsor in that locality. So what's happening is, according to the New York Times article, I'll just set them here for now. What's happening, according to the New York Times article, is some of these people are abusing the system. How many it is, whether it's 85,000 or 10,000, doesn't matter to me. There are kids who are being lost in the system, and part of the problem is, and this is where my amendment comes in, part of the problem is nobody locally knows they're there. So when the 12-year-old or the 14-year-old doesn't show up for school, there's nobody looking at them or trying to find them. Nobody from Floyd County High School is saying, well, hey, how come this child who was placed into our jurisdiction isn't showing up for school? This amendment fixes that problem. And here's how it does it. One, we've also had implications that sometimes the addresses aren't accurate that they're sending these kids off to. They're sending them to somebody at an address that may not even exist. Some people have 12, 13 kids that they've gotten to be sponsors. What this just says is that they got to notify a local health or welfare agency of the information that's in the bill to be collected, and two, coordinate with that agency to conduct a site visit of a residence to determine that it meets applicable minimum safety standards. What that does is that triggers Department of Social Services. One, we're going to see if it at least meets minimum standards for housing a kid. When I was practicing law, if we didn't check to see that the home of a child who was involved in a custody dispute or custody battle was at least adequate, didn't have to be fancy, but clean, adequate for safety. So this makes sure they're doing that. And secondly, once Department of Social Services has an address, they're going to notify the school system. We have a child of school age who needs to be enrolled. It's that simple. This is about the kids. Y'all can hate the bill for the rest of it if you want to on the Democrat side. But this amendment is about taking care of our responsibilities. Once we accept them into this country, whether they're supposed to be here or not does not matter. We have a duty to protect underage children, and that's what this amendment is about, and I hope that you all will find it in order and adopt it.
Thank you very much. We're going to go through everybody's testimony just so you all know first, and then we'll move through questions after that. So next, my good friend from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, you're recognized to testify on your amendment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cole, Mr. McGovern, and members of the Rules Committee. It is really difficult to think that I might say something here that will be different from other arguments that have been made. I do recall the recent testimony of Chairman Smith and Ranking Member of the Subcommittee on Work and Welfare, Mr. Davis, when they talked about the intent of the overpayments for unemployment insurance. And what I will say before I begin my testimony on my amendments, just as a reflection on their testimony, is that the problem with this bill is that it really does conflate overpayments with fraud. To my understanding, my reading of the bill, the states would be required to attempt to recover overpayments, whether they were due to fraud or not, and folks would be subject for up to 10 years of the state coming after them, whether they were at fault or not. And so I think that this is very intimidating to most recipients of unemployment insurance. I think we can all agree on both sides of the aisle that this was a lifeline for most Americans, and that we don't want people to be in a situation where they rue the day that they accepted this lifeline because it's going to open a door to their being harassed by the state because how would they know whether these were overpayments or not? This was emergency funding. How would they know that they were being overpaid simply because in a state like mine, and I'm embarrassed to say that I come from a state where the equipment for determining unemployment insurance is something from the 60s. And so their capacity to keep up with current payment technologies was not adequate. And so since Mr. Smith indicated that the intent of this legislation, and I have no reason to disbelieve him, although I don't really see it statutorily, since I see them conflating line after line overpayments with fraud, that it's only intended for those people who have defrauded the system, and certainly all of us want payments to be, for the $2 billion we set aside in this bill, to be utilized to go after people who were in criminal organizations, or our colleague here whose name was used to apply for unemployment benefits. We certainly want to go after every single one of those people. But since there is an intent to hold harmless those people who are innocent, my amendments really deal with the most vulnerable people who perhaps received unemployment benefits. And so briefly, I will talk about my 4 amendments, and I'll only lift up 2 of them and just submit in writing my entire statement. My amendments would require states to waive overpayments of pandemic employment benefits that were made to foster parents who were without fault in the unemployment insurance overpayment. A worker in a household that included a foster child in 2020 or that currently includes a foster child. Mr. Cole, Mr. McGovern, we rely on foster parents to take in, and we ask them to do this during a global pandemic, to take in children, over 200,000 of them, during a pandemic, and they themselves were suffering unemployment, underemployment, displacement, but they still had to take care of these foster kids. We know that the monies that we provide to foster families are not adequate for meeting all of the foster care kids' needs. And yet, these people took care of them alongside their own children, their other responsibilities, and now to say that we are going to, I apologize for that. That phone was for you, so I was get a call regarding when I was going to come here. To say that we're going to burden them with 10 years of harassment and clawing back these funds that have already been spent. Let's face it, these funds are not available. They're not sitting in their offshore bank accounts anywhere. And I would say that since there is an intent on the part of the authors of this bill to not subject people who were not fraudulent, that we articulate by adopting my amendment that one of the most vulnerable families are those families that housed foster kids. And of course, also, another amendment would hold harmless foster youth who are under the age of 26 that may have received unemployment benefits, not fraudulently, but unintended, of no fault of their own. I also have amendments that would hold harmless parents receiving the Women, Infant, and Children's Program, WIC. We know by definition that these are the poorest families, and Mr. McGovern, I know how hard you work on food insecurity, so we know that people who receive WIC are among those, and those who currently live in low-income housing. I think it would save states a lot of paperwork if we were to adopt my amendments and at least give them a baseline of people to whom they have to send these letters out to, and to say that we're not going to send them to foster families unless we can prove that these people were part of a criminal organization or that there was fraud, and not mix in overpayments with fraudulent behavior. And I think that in the interest of time, I'll yield back. But I certainly want to be available, Mr. Cole, Mr. McGovern, members of the committee, for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thought my voice was loud enough, and I thank you for reminding me. I will speak to both H.R. 2 and H.R. 1163, Mr. Chairman. I have amendments. And thank you for your courtesies this time, and for those members who my back is to, please forgive me. We come to this place as Americans, and I would hope that as we have our different views, it is recognized and respected that there are probably constituents, even beyond the boundaries of our congressional districts, that really believe as we do. I think I'm the only member at this table from Texas. I know that there are many who will say that they've been to the border. I've been to the border for almost 2 decades, and I know what the media views are showing to the nation and the characterizations of fear. But I can assure you that the persons who are coming may not all have credible fear, but they all have desperate situations that cause them to walk thousands of miles. I want to publicly say on the record my deepest sympathy and concern for the horrible killing of individuals who simply wanted to be here for a difference, and grateful to the Brownsville police that have apprehended the culprit, who we're still trying to determine whether he maliciously killed these innocent persons. I think this Border Act would do well to take a second look and try to get us to work together. But in the meantime, let me quickly just add my amendments that would hope to capture the values of this nation that when Americans travel overseas, they're so proud of to be looked on as an American. My First Amendment, which is number 17, would add a mens rea requirement such that in order to be criminally liable, a person must be knowingly and willingly overstay their visa. Remember, if you have a visa, you have accessed legal immigration. You have a visa. That's legal immigration. That's what we want to promote. And I don't think we'll have any difficulty finding the scandalous persons, but there are persons who are in the hospital. There are persons who are not clear on the rules. There are persons who were trying to get an extension. There are persons who have family situations. So it is important to remember that an individual can make an honest mistake about when they need to depart the country, be physically incapable of departing the country, or unable to return because of circumstances beyond their control in their home country. And because they don't know all the rules, they're thinking they could stay, seek asylum, or some other process, and yes, it may be wrong. But I think to add a criminal liability, it is not going to deter people. It's just going to fill up our jails. And I would just add this. These people who are overstayed, they're already subject to removal. You don't have to do anything. You catch them, they're subject to removal. The addition of a criminal penalty is both cruel and unnecessary. I asked my colleagues, I asked the Rules Committee to make that in order. My Second Amendment, number 41, will require the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement to provide Congress with a plan for implementing within 1 year the use of body-worn cameras by its agents and officers who are engaged in border security or immigration enforcement activities. I'm around a lot of law enforcement. They love body cameras. They are not against them, they're for them. And when I was down at the border, those personnel indicated their willingness to have body cameras. Any implementation of a plan for body-worn cameras will require additional congressional action. Both CBP and ICE have already begun deploying body-worn cameras to their frontline officers and agents to provide greater transparency and interaction with the public. In the event there are allegations or other matters that would help those who are on the front lines. And several studies have indicated the effectiveness of body-worn cameras and found police officers wearing generate significantly fewer complaints. They like them. My Third Amendment to H.R. 2, this is all H.R. 2, and final amendment for H.R. 2, number 44, would clarify the official policy of the United States as implemented by the agencies of the Department of Homeland Security shall be to keep families together and not remove children from parents or responsible adults unless the safety or welfare of the child is at risk. I lived through the horrors of child separation, punishment that occurred in the last administration. I don't think any of us, I heard Republicans and Democrats arguing against the separation of families and children. CBP would bar them from separating children from their families unless there's evidence that the child is being trafficked. Smuggling is different from being trafficked, but if there's something dastardly with the child, then that could be determined by those officers. It is further directs the DHS in coordination with the State Department, HHS, Attorney General to provide quarterly reports to helping us keep families and children together. Just look at the horrors of separation. I've seen it firsthand, and the difficulty of being able to move quickly. Not quickly, but to bring those families back together. Let me move to H.R. 1163, protecting taxpayers victims of unemployment fraud. As my other colleagues have indicated, none of us like fraud, the misuse of federal dollars. Chairman Cole, you know I want those dollars, as everybody else does, in their districts. But let me give you these amendments very quickly. Amendment number 41 under H.R. 1163 would require that states waive overpayments of pandemic unemployment benefits that were made to law enforcement personnel and security in 2021 who were without fault in the UI payments. I was out there during the pandemic, and so are my law enforcement officers. It's no telling what they might have calculated or what they might have kept up with. They were hardly at their family's home. They were out there dealing with the crisis of the pandemic every single day. And so I can't imagine them being succumbing to this overpayment requirement when they were out serving the public. That is my amendment number 41. My amendment number 42 requires states to waive overpayments of pandemic unemployment benefits that were made to firefighters and emergency personnel in 2021 or 2021 who were without fault in the UI overpayments. No doubt, fire departments were picking up COVID patients every day without ceasing. They were unending and overworked. Please, I ask you to make my amendment in order. My final one, 43, would delay enactment until the Secretary certifies that no provisions would result in school personnel, including teachers and support staff, in 2020 and 2021 without fault in the UI overpayment, meaning that you could not find that they really were part of a scheme and they were working it and making sure they got all that money unfairly, that they would be forced to repay overpayments due to state error. And I would say to you that teachers were under stress during that period. We were requiring them to find some way to teach children, many vulnerable children, and I can't imagine that they would have time to spend allegedly, fraudulently trying to secure funds. And unless that can be certified that these folk were right there in the middle of conspiracy, none of these public servants should be held to this unfortunate standard that they were trying to fraudulently take money through an overpayment. So I ask for the amendments number 41, number 42, and number 43 under H.R. 1163 to be made in order. And I ask for my amendments under H.R. 2, number 12, number 17, number 41, and interestingly enough, number 44 under H.R. 2 be made in order. I thank you all very much for your courtesy tonight. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Rouser from North Carolina, you're recognized to testify in favor of whatever amendments you care to.
Well, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the committee. I know you got a lot ahead of you, so I'm going to tell you like Elizabeth Taylor told all her husbands, I ain't going to keep you long. I've got two amendments I want to highlight. Amendment number 9 mirrors the Asylum Accountability Act that Senator Tillis and I have introduced. And current law basically says you can't receive any benefit for 10 years if you refuse to show up for your asylum hearing. Our legislation would make that a permanent ban, not just a 10-year ban, in order to improve the incentives. So that's amendment number 9. Amendment number 21 freezes the flawed 2023 adverse effect wage rate, or AWR as it's known, and temporarily resets the AWR at 2022 levels. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the H-2A program that farmers use for their labor. The costs continue to go up, and it's not just the adverse effect wage rate. For example, in North Carolina, it's moved up from $14.12 or so to $14.91. I know in Florida, it's increased 12 to 15%, the same in Michigan, and many other states have experienced significant increases as well, particularly over the last several years. And that cost is going to continue to increase with the inflation pressures, obviously. And not only is it the adverse effect wage rate that farmers are paying, they're paying for the travel to and from, they're paying for the housing, all kinds of fees and other costs associated with acquiring legal labor. And our farmers want to use legal labor, but this is a program that is so costly and so burdensome, so cumbersome, that they even use a third party to contract the labor for them to help jump through those hoops. Although there's a lot of reform that needs to be made to the H-2A program, this amendment strictly focuses on the adverse effect wage, freezing that at the 2022 level rather than the exponential increase that our farmers are going to see in 2023. So that's amendment number 2. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Correa, you're recognized for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Cole and Ranking Member McGovern and members of the committee. I'm also going to make mine very brief. First of all, to my amendments to Division A are amendments that I think all of us can agree on, essentially to support our CBP workforce and to provide real solutions to combating human and narcotics trafficking. My recent visits to the southern border, Laredo, Brownsville, Yuma, El Centro, San Isidro, where I've been most of my life, I've talked to frontline CBP officers at and between our ports of entry. they've all said the same thing. They need help in recruiting and retaining personnel. At our ports of entry, where 90% of the fentanyl is seized at our ports of entry, and yet our CBP officers at ports of entry are left out of this legislation when it comes to support. My amendments, simply 33, 34, and 35, will improve the recruitment and retention of these officers and agents by giving them better pay and providing them with child care. Better pay, go from GS5 to GS7 in terms of starting pay, requiring OPM to establish a special rate of pay for those geographic areas that are very expensive, like San Diego, to live in. And finally, you talk about forced overtime, shortage of workers. They got to work overtime. A lot of these folks have families. What do they do with their families? Causes a lot of stress. Provide child care for them. And of course, another amendment, next amendment, number 48, would essentially enhance our ability to combat all kinds of smuggling by expanding our bilateral cooperation among Mexico and other Central American countries. Finally, Division B, I have two amendments. Amendment 8 would strike the retroactive provisions that apply an indefinite detention mandate to current families and individuals who are already in immigration proceedings. These are folks that are already known to ICE. These are folks that check in with ICE periodically. So these folks also, many of them have work authorizations. Their children are going to school, essentially legitimately almost. Why would you all of a sudden round them up and arrest them? Doesn't make sense. Finally, Amendment 10 would codify the current military parole program that existed under Obama and was continued under the Trump administration. And this is available to undocumented service members, veterans, and their families. We made a promise, folks, to these veterans and their families to take care of them. We can't go back on that promise. I urge the committee to grant an open rule for this bill and to please consider my amendments. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. Mr. Gruffman, you're recognized to testify on behalf of any amendments you care to.
Thank you. Try to get through here quickly. I've been down on the border several times. One of the things the Border Patrol always points out to me, they have me take a look of all the people coming across, and they feel a large majority of the people crossing the southern border are not desperate. That's one thing they always point out to me. Look at the jewelry, look at the clothes, not. But in any event, I have three amendments for you folks to look at. As you know, one of the problems that's been reported, the Office of Refugee Resettlement seems to have lost 85,000 kids in the past 2 years. There was a time where people in this institution used to worry about families being separated from each other. Now we have a real situation in which families are separated from each other, and we don't seem to make as big a deal about it as I think we should. In any event, the First Amendment, Amendment 49, would require the Office of Refugee Resettlement to report unaccompanied minors that have been placed with sponsors as missing to the National Crime Information Center if ORR could not contact the sponsor of an unaccompanied minor for the purpose of follow-up within 120 days, or the sponsor of an unaccompanied minor does not contact ORR for the purpose of follow-up within 120 days. Next, with regard to, again, unaccompanied minors, in order to deal with the huge volume of people coming across, Secretary Becerra's demands for an assembly, because of Secretary Becerra's demands for assembly line speed, ORR felt they right now are not keeping track of addresses of all the sponsors. And my amendment require ORR to reinstate proof of address requirement and conduct background on all household members with screening sponsors. So in other words, if we have people in the house who aren't the sponsor, we'd like background checks on them as well. When I was down on the border, they give an example. What if you're going there, your sponsor's the uncle, but you have 5 other guys in the house? We ought to get the background check on everybody in the house. That's Amendment 50. And Amendment 51, I've spoken on the floor about how good the K-9 units do as far as identifying any fentanyl or other drugs coming across the border. Absolutely phenomenal. Would like to have more of them, but my third amendment would direct the Government of Accountability Office, or the GAO, to conduct a study and issue a report to Congress on the expanded use of K-9 units within the CBP. And anybody who's at the border, I think, would realize that it'd be a good thing if we had an added recommendation for more K-9 units. Thank you very much. Hopefully that was quick enough.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Davis. Good to have you back on this panel. You're recognized to testify on behalf of whatever amendment you care to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I shall be brief also. Instead of punishing organized crime, H.R. 1163 punishes workers, including current Social Security recipients, foster youth, and homeless youth. Unconscionably, the GOP bill was sent an estimated $91 million in surprise bills to American workers who received accidental overpayments through no fault of their own. Further, this clawback of benefits can occur up to 10 years after these unemployed workers spent the funds on basic necessities like shelter and food. I have 3 amendments to protect 3 groups of workers from these clawbacks: Social Security beneficiaries, foster youth, and youth experiencing homelessness. I ask unanimous consent that my full testament in support of each amendment be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
In 2021, approximately 70 million people received Social Security, with 5.4 million people newly receiving Social Security benefits. Social Security benefits represent about 30% of the income of the elderly, and Social Security provides 90% of income for about 16% of seniors. According to the Children's Bureau, over 19,000 aged out of care in 2021, and another 551 ran away. According to a recent study, approximately 3.5 million young adults aged 18 to 25 and another 700,000 youth aged 13 to 17 experienced homelessness in 1 year. Both homeless youth and foster youth face substantial barriers to well-being. They often experience poor academic preparation due to over-enrollment in low-performing high schools, housing instability, considerable financial hardship, and limited social capital to help them navigate the transition to adulthood. The Republican bill would impose on each of these groups a sudden demand to repay thousands of dollars in accidental overpayments they received through no fault of their own. CBO scores of these amendments make clear that the amendments will protect innocent Social Security beneficiaries, foster youth, and homeless youth. Given that my amendments only protect innocent workers from the clawback of overpayments, the fact that the CBO indicates that my amendments increase direct spending proves that the Republican bill will make Social Security beneficiaries, foster youth, and homeless youth repay overpayments. The Republican claim that only foster will pay is incorrect. If the committee makes the manager's amendment order that increases direct revenue to protect businesses from having to pay more in taxes, I hope the committee will also make my amendment in order to protect innocent Social Security beneficiaries. Just like Congress gave over $757 billion in Paycheck Protection Program loans to businesses during the pandemic, Congress owes Social Security recipients, foster youth, and homeless youth similar grace. My final amendment would give my colleagues the recognition they deserve for their support for this bill, so that all residents in their home states who must repay the overpayments are told which representatives and senators from their state voted for this act. This is a valuable opportunity for Republican legislators to convey back home the importance of reclaiming these funds. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
I thank you for your testimony. Indeed, I thank all of you for your testimony. I have no questions. Recognize the ranking member for any questions he may have.
Well, first of all, Mr. Chair, let me just make an observation. Hillary Clinton once said it takes a village. I say it takes an air conditioner. It's hot here. I mean, we got to figure this system out here. And let me ask unanimous consent to insert into the record statements from Representatives Nikema Williams, Adriano Espaillat, and Dwight Evans in support of their amendments to H.R. 1163.
Without objection.
And again, I thank all of you for being here today. And I just want to say that we heard from Chairman Smith on the unemployment bill that he's asking for a closed rule. And so I'm assuming that's foreshadowing about what's to come. And I worry that what we're going to see on the immigration bill, because it is the subject of such turmoil within the Republican conference right now, is also a closed rule. And I don't know whether my Republican colleagues, I mean, Mr. Griffith, you were very passionate about your amendment. I don't know whether you're willing to vote to block your own amendment tomorrow if it comes up, but that may very well be the outcome. And maybe you need to threaten to do that to get into the Speaker's office so they can maybe put you in a manager's amendment or something, because I have a feeling that we're headed toward two closed rules here. Maybe I'm wrong, but we will see what happens. But I will point out that my Republican friends are now way ahead of where we were in the 116th and the 117th Congress in terms of completely closed rules. I'm starting to look good to some of you on the Republican side. But the bottom line is, I mean, we are now way, way beyond where we were. And I think this is becoming a pattern. Maybe because you got a slight majority, but I'm simply saying that some of these amendments, to me, sound like they might even get bipartisan support. So I think that's where we are, and I think that's something you guys are going to have to think about. And for my Democratic colleagues, we will offer the amendments at the appropriate time. There's four of us that you got our vote. But in any event, I appreciate you taking the time, and I yield back.
Thank my friend, Mr. Burgess. You're recognized for questions.
I just wanted to be clear that I think Mr. Griffith had asked for unanimous consent for his email to be made part of the record.
Without objection.
And I thank you for being here. And that was a very good hearing that you conducted the other day. In fact, I put the IG's report into our record here because I thought it was so important. So thank you for your efforts on this. Your subcommittee is one that is, I mean, historically, we are the ones who've stood up. There was no, prior to 2014, there was no phone call. There was no vetting. No one cared whether or not these kids had immunizations before they ended up in our schools, if they had a TB test, and it was the Subcommittee of Oversight and Investigations on the Energy and Commerce Committee that made sure that those services were provided. So thank you for bringing this to our attention tonight.
Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for questions.
I just wanted to thank my co-chair on the Foster Youth Caucus for her constant attention to the needs of that very marginalized group, and also my colleagues on Judiciary Committee for continuing to try to make a pretty bad bill at least a little bit better. So thank you.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for questions. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for questions.
I think the chair, I would just underscore the comments made by our ranking member. I think each of the members that testified this evening made thoughtful presentations on the particular amendments that they would like to have the Congress consider, and none of them, of course, are compelled to be here at 9:30 in the evening in front of the Rules Committee, taking time out of their schedules to make the case. One would hope that this committee would treat these requests with the seriousness they deserve, and would do that by considering an open rule and not having yet another closed rule be reported out of this committee. So I would echo the sentiments expressed by our ranking member and thank the members on both sides of the aisles for making their presentations.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for questions.
Just quickly, Congressman Griffin, you're, I think in your statement, you mentioned, children accepted into the United States. Is this, two things. I'm on a local children's detention home for abused and abandoned children. They don't have room for anybody, not to mention with the illegals coming across this country, particularly Title 42 ending. Does this give a cause of action? There will not be a state in this country that's going to have the room unless I'm missing something. Does this not give a cause of action for a lawsuit?
This is just a notification from ORR to the local Department of Social Services or other appropriate agency that they have placed a child. So this, I agree with you, they probably ought not be here. But what happens is when an unaccompanied minor comes to the border, they go to an ORR facility. At that point, they become, in essence, they're our responsibility, whether we want them or not. At that point, we have a duty to protect them. What we're doing is we're sending them all over the country. They have a name or somebody's signed up to be their sponsor. And what we have discovered is that ORR is not doing a background check that we would consider appropriate in the court system. They do an internet search to see if the person's name pops up with a criminal record. That's about it. They don't do a home inspection. They don't look at anything. So this doesn't put them into a home. It just says that somebody in the local government, in HHS is going to notify them, and HHS is going to make arrangements to have them at least put eyes on the house to make sure it's minimally safe. That's it.
Okay, I mean, this pulls at your heartstrings, but South Carolina is not a border state. We've got children already sleeping under bridges. There is no place that I know of, not to mention the classrooms, not to mention Salvation Army, not to mention, God only knows what's going to happen to these children. I just wonder when you have if the reporting does take place, what are they going to do with it? I mean, because there's not enough housing in this country, particularly in my state, that's going to do it. And
that's a good question, because right now, from what I can tell, it appears that OR, once they place them with a sponsor, basically washes their hands of any responsibility for them. They don't do they don't do a home inspection of any type. They don't do a proper background check that would be required for any of your kids in South Carolina who are already there that you're having issues with. The court, some of the reasons that they're in these homes is the court has gone in, Department of Social Services, determined the home is inappropriate and pulled the kids out. None of that, nobody's looking at these homes. And so when the New York Times, that Mr. Reschenthaler put in the New York Times article, when they're doing interviews, these kids are telling the New York Times they'd like to go to school, but they have to work all the time. And nobody locally even knows they're there because ORR has never told anybody. Yeah. So my main thrust is, let's get ORR to tell somebody. We probably would have to have additional legislation later to say what happens when ORR finds out that the house or the home or the residence they've placed them in is not appropriate. But right now, there's nothing happening. And these kids are slipping through the cracks in large numbers. We don't know exactly how much. New York Times estimated 85,000. Some folks have disputed that, but there are kids being lost. We know that. And it's just not right for that to happen. It's just not right.
Well, it's not right what's happening what's allowed to be happening on the border to this country.
And I would agree with that, too.
And I don't know how you walk this back at all. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I really want to thank Representative Moore and Ranking Member Davis for their amendments. during the first panel, we heard over and over again from the chair that the 10-year clawback was only intended to apply if there was fraud. I looked at the bill, and the bill clearly says on page 3, it just says striking 3-year and inserting 10-year. I am an attorney, but you don't need to be an attorney to read that that applies to everything. And so, the issue with regards to only fraud applies to whether a state can keep half the money or not. So I really do thank you for those amendments to make sure that we are not harming innocent workers who lost their jobs, received overpayment through no fault of their own. And here you go, surprise billing. This is not the first time Democrats have been standing up to protect our workers and our families from surprise billing. And we have had pushback and resistance from Republicans, so thank you very much for that. And I also really want to thank Representative Correa, because so many individuals have served our country in the military valiantly. They have spouses, parents, kids. Your amendments, which are many, actually recognize that they deserve protection, and you would codify what actually had been occurring under both the Obama and the Trump administration. So the bill we are looking at now would be more punitive, and you are trying to protect the military. And I think if one wants to stand with our military, if one wants to stand for those true patriots, they would support your amendments and your other amendments that are just intended to make CBP a better place to work. Is that how you would describe your amendments, Representative Correa? And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Are there any additional, gentlelady from Indiana, recognized for questions. Thank you very much. Any additional questions for this panel? Seeing none, I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony, and you are all excused. Is there anyone else seeking to testify on H.R. 2 or H.R. 1163? Seeing none, this closes the hearing portion. Without objection, the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.